When Jesus was 12 years old, his family found him in the temple, astonishing the teachers with his questions. And then the Bible goes silent. The next time we see him, he is a grown man of 30, walking down to the Jordan River to be baptized. Between those two moments lie 18 years, almost the entire span of his life, that the Gospels never explain. 18 years. Think about that. We know the story of his birth. We know the 3 years of his ministry, almost day by day. We know his death and his resurrection. But the 18 years in between, the years that took him from a boy in the temple to the man who would change the world, the Bible passes over in complete silence. It tells us almost nothing. Where was he? What was he doing? How did he live? Who did he become in all those hidden years? And here is what almost no one stops to consider. For the overwhelming majority of his life on earth, Jesus was not a preacher, not a miracle worker, not a public figure at all. He was a village craftsman, a carpenter in a poor, forgotten town, doing ordinary work, living an ordinary life, entirely unknown to the world. The Son of God spent the vast bulk of his years on this earth in total obscurity, and we have been taught almost nothing about it. In this video, we are going to walk into those silent years and reconstruct them. The workshop where he spent his days, the tools in his hands, the death that changed his family forever, the ordinary mornings and the long, ordinary decades in a town no one had heard of, the years of waiting, when the promise of his birth seemed almost forgotten, and the quiet, hidden formation of the man who would one day walk out of that village and change everything. We are going to rebuild the hidden life of Jesus and step inside it. A note before we begin. The Gospels record nothing at all between the age of 12 and the beginning of his ministry. So almost everything in this video is a careful reconstruction, built from the two facts we do have. That he worked as a carpenter, and that his father Joseph disappears from the story, together with what we know of daily life in first-century Galilee and the earliest Christian traditions. Where we are imagining, we will say so. This is the hidden life, rebuilt with care. It begins with the last glimpse the Bible gives us, a boy of 12, and then the doors of Scripture closing. The last thing the Bible tells us about the childhood of Jesus is a single scene, and it is worth beginning there, because it is the doorway into all the silence that follows. The family had gone up to Jerusalem for the Passover festival, as they did every year. And on the way home, traveling in the great caravan of pilgrims, Mary and Joseph realized with horror that their 12-year-old son was not among them. They rushed back to the city, and for 3 days they searched, every parent's nightmare, a child lost in a great crowded city. And at last they found him, in the temple, sitting among the teachers of the law, listening to them and asking them questions. And everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding. And when his mother, weak with relief and worry, asked him why he had done this to them, he gave the answer that has echoed ever since. "Why were you searching for me?" he said. "Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" Even at 12, he knew, in some way, who he was. He belonged to a purpose larger than the family. And Luke tells us that Mary did not fully understand, but treasured it in her heart. And then, this is the crucial part. Luke tells us what came next. He went down with them, and came to Nazareth, and was obedient to them. And he grew in wisdom and in stature, and in favor with God and man. And that is it. That is the last we hear. The boy who had just declared he must be about his father's business went home to a poor village and submitted himself to his parents and grew up. And the door of Scripture closes on him for 18 years. Sit with the strangeness of that. Here is the most important person who has ever lived. And the Gospels, which record his 3 years of ministry in such detail, say nothing at all about the next 18 years of his life. From 12 to 30, there is silence. No stories, no sayings, no miracles, nothing. As if those years did not matter, as if they were empty. But they were not empty. They were, in fact, the great majority of his life. If Jesus lived to around 33, then these hidden years, from 12 to 30, make up more than half of his entire time on this earth. More than half. The public ministry that fills the Gospels was only the final 3 years. The rest, the overwhelming bulk of his life, was lived in the silence of Nazareth. And the fact that the Gospels leave it blank does not mean nothing happened. It means we have to reconstruct it. And when we do, something remarkable comes into view, and people have always wondered about these years. Wondered so much that legends grew up to fill the silence. Over the centuries, stories appeared claiming that Jesus had traveled to distant lands in the missing years, to Egypt, to India, to Britain, learning secret wisdom from far-off teachers. These are not history. They are the imagination of later ages, trying to fill a gap that felt too important to leave empty. And the truth is quieter and far more powerful than any of them. Because the evidence we actually have, the one word his own townspeople used for him, the carpenter, points not to exotic travels, but to the exact opposite. It points to a man who never left, who stayed, who spent those years not gathering secret knowledge in far countries, but doing ordinary work in the town where he was raised. The real secret of the hidden years is that there was no secret. There was a workshop and a family and a village and a life of humble faithfulness. And that is more astonishing than any legend. Because there is one thing the Gospels do tell us about those years, dropped almost in passing, that unlocks everything. Later, when Jesus returned to Nazareth as a famous teacher, the people of his own town were offended by him, and they said, in effect, "Who does he think he is?" And in their scorn, they named what he had been. "Is this not the carpenter?" they said. "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary?" The carpenter. That is what he had been all those hidden years. Not a scholar, not a priest, not a rabbi. A carpenter, a working man, a craftsman with rough hands, known to the whole village as the man who fixed their roofs and made their tools and built their doors. And so, to reconstruct the hidden years, we begin where he spent them, not in a temple, not in a palace, not in a school of philosophers, in a workshop, in the sawdust and the sweat and the ordinary daily labor of a village carpenter. That is where the Son of God spent the silent years. Let us go in. To understand the hidden years, you have to understand the trade. Because for the better part of 2 decades, this was the daily world of Jesus. The workshop, the tools, the wood, the work. The word the Gospels use that we translate as carpenter meant something broader in his world than it does in ours. It meant a craftsman who worked with hard materials, wood, and often stone as well. A builder, a maker, the kind of man a village depended on for the practical, physical work of daily life. And it is worth correcting a picture many people carry. He was not making delicate furniture in a comfortable shop. The work of a village craftsman in Galilee was hard, physical labor, roof beams, door frames, yokes for oxen, plows and tool handles for the farmers, repairs of every kind. The heavy, sweaty, practical work of keeping a poor community's buildings and tools in working order. Picture his hands. This is important, and we almost never think of it. The hands that would one day be pierced with nails, the hands that would bless bread and touch the sick and lift up children. Those hands, for 18 years, were the rough, calloused, scarred hands of a manual laborer. Hands that knew the grain of wood and the weight of a mallet. Hands with splinters and old cuts and the thick calluses of a man who worked with them every single day. When people met Jesus during his ministry, they were meeting a man with a workman's hands, and he would have learned it all from Joseph. This is how a trade passed down in that world, from father to son, at the bench, over years. As a boy, Jesus would have started with the small tasks, sweeping the shavings, sorting the wood, holding the pieces steady. Then the simple work, under Joseph's eye. Then, as the years passed, the real skills. How to read a piece of timber, how to join wood so it would hold, how to make a thing true and strong and lasting. Year by year, Joseph taught him, and year by year, the boy became a craftsman. By the time he was a young man, Jesus would have been a skilled carpenter in his own right, the equal of his father at the bench. And think about what that daily work would have shaped in him. The patience of it, that you cannot rush good work, that wood has its own nature you have to respect and cannot force. The honesty of it, that a badly made joint will fail, that you cannot fake sound work, that the truth of a thing shows up under weight. The humility of it, that good work serves people quietly in the ordinary needs of their lives. The dignity of honest labor done well. Every one of these lessons is written into the trade of carpentry. And Jesus lived inside that trade for 18 years. It formed him. The man who would later speak of building a house on rock, who would call himself the cornerstone, who would speak again and again of what is sound and what is false. That man had spent 18 years learning exactly those things with his hands. And consider the economics of that life, because it tells you how he lived. A village craftsman in Galilee was not poor in the sense of destitute. He had a trade, a skill, a way to earn. But he was far from comfortable. He worked for a poor clientele in a poor town, in a region taxed heavily by Rome and by the local rulers. Payment often came not in coin, but in goods. A portion of a harvest, some oil, some grain, a service in return. It was a hand-to-mouth existence, dependent on the seasons and the needs of neighbors who had little to spare. There was no security in it, no savings to fall back on, no cushion against a bad year. Jesus knew, from the inside, what it was to work hard for little, to depend on the goodwill of others, to live close to the edge the way most people in his world and in ours have always lived. And there is a detail here that would have shaped him in a particular way. Nazareth sat only a few miles from a large city that was being built up in those very years. The city of Sepphoris, a major construction project within walking distance of his village. Many scholars believe that Joseph, and then Jesus, may well have found work there, among the crews of laborers and craftsmen building a city. If so, then Jesus would have known the world of the day laborer intimately. The men who gathered in the marketplace at dawn hoping to be hired, the ones who worked all day and the ones who found no work, the wages paid at evening, the foremen and the crews and the hard physical world of ancient construction. And it is striking that when he later told a parable about laborers hired to work in a vineyard, some at dawn and some at the 11th hour, he was describing a world he had lived in with his own hands. And notice, too, what the work was not. It was not important. It was not famous. It made no history. Day after day, for years, Jesus did work that no one would remember. A door here, a yoke there, a roof repaired, a plow mended. Ordinary work for ordinary people in an ordinary town. The Son of God spent the great bulk of his life doing humble, unremarkable, honest work that left no record at all. And there is something staggering in that, when you let it land, that God, come to earth, chose to spend most of his human life not performing miracles, but making things with his hands, serving the small daily needs of a poor village, entirely unknown. So let us live one of those hidden days with him, hour by hour, because the silent years were made of thousands of ordinary days exactly like it. And the ordinariness is the whole point. He would have woken before dawn, the way everyone in that world did, when the light governed the day and there was no reason to stay in the dark. He would have risen in the simple family home, a poor house of stone and mud, 1 or 2 rooms, shared sleeping space. The animals perhaps kept close at night. And his first act, like every devout Jew of his world, would have been prayer. The prayers of his people, said at the start of the day, the words he had known since childhood. Before he was anything the world would later call him, Jesus began his days the way his neighbors did, with the ancient prayers in the gray light before the sun. Then the morning meal, bread, likely, and perhaps some olives or oil, the simple food of the poor. The bread his mother had made, or was making, the smell of it filling the small house. And then to work. Across the yard, or a few steps down the lane, to the workshop, where the day's labor waited. The tools taken down, the wood examined, the jobs of the day begun, and the long hours of physical work through the morning, in the growing heat. And picture the village around him as he worked. Nazareth was tiny, a few hundred people at most, everyone known to everyone. Through the open door of the workshop, the life of the village would flow past all day. The women going to the well and back, the farmers heading out to the terraced fields and the olive groves, the children in the lanes, the shepherds with their flocks, neighbors stopping to talk, to bring a job, to collect a finished piece. Jesus was not separate from this world. He was woven into it, a known, ordinary, trusted member of a small community, working in full view of his neighbors, part of the daily fabric of the town. And think about what that meant. For 18 years, Jesus knew these people. He watched them live. He saw the farmer sowing his seed, and some of it falling on the path, and some among the thorns. He saw the woman searching her whole house for a lost coin. He saw the shepherd out on the hills with his flock. He watched fathers and sons, and debts and quarrels and reconciliations, and weddings and funerals, and the small dramas of ordinary human life play out, year after year, in a village where he knew everyone. He was not observing humanity from a distance. He was living inside it, elbow to elbow, for 18 years. And here is something quietly astonishing. Every one of those ordinary sights would one day become a parable. When Jesus finally began to teach, he did not speak in abstractions. He spoke of sowers and seeds, of lost coins and lost sheep, of vineyards and fig trees, of a man building a house, of yeast and dough, of a father and 2 sons. He spoke, in other words, of exactly the world he had spent 18 silent years living inside. The hidden years were not empty. They were the years he was filling up with the ordinary human life he would later hold up to the light. Every parable was already there, in the village, in the daily watching. He spent 18 years gathering it. And there was one day each week that broke the rhythm of the work, the Sabbath. From Friday evening to Saturday evening, all labor stopped, and the whole village turned to rest and to God. Picture it. The workshop closed, the tools laid down, the family gathered, the Sabbath meal, and then the gathering at the synagogue. Because even a village as small as Nazareth would have had its synagogue, the place where the community came together to hear the scriptures read and taught. And there, week after week, year after year, Jesus sat among his neighbors and heard the sacred writings of his people, the law, the prophets, the Psalms. He would have known them deeply. By the time he was a grown man, the scriptures of Israel were written into him, not as a scholar's abstract learning, but as the living inheritance of a devout man who had heard and prayed and pondered them his whole life. And there is a moment later that shows us the fruit of all those hidden Sabbaths. When Jesus finally returned to Nazareth as a teacher, he went, the Gospel says, to the synagogue on the Sabbath, as was his custom, as was his custom. In one small phrase, the hidden years open up. This was his habit, his lifelong practice, the thing he had done every week for 30 years. He stood up to read, and they handed him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and he found the place and read. This was a man utterly at home in the scriptures, because he had spent a lifetime of hidden Sabbath steeped in them. The public moment revealed what the hidden years had built. And then the day would end, the light going golden, then red. The tools laid down, the evening meal with the family, the prayers again as the day closed, the lamp lit against the dark. And then sleep, in the small house, in the quiet village, under the stars. And then the same again the next day, and the next, and the next. For 18 years. This was the hidden life, not dramatic, not recorded, just an ordinary, faithful, working life, lived out day by day in a town no one had heard of. And somewhere in all those ordinary days, something extraordinary was quietly being made ready. But the hidden years were not only quiet and ordinary. Somewhere in the middle of them, they held the first great grief of Jesus' life. Because somewhere in those silent years, Joseph died. The Gospels never tell us this directly, but they tell us by their silence. Joseph is present all through the birth and the childhood. He is there at Bethlehem, there for the flight to Egypt, there in the temple when Jesus is 12. And then he vanishes. He is never mentioned again. He is not there when Jesus begins his ministry. He is not at the wedding at Cana. He is not at the cross where, if he had been alive, he would have cared for Mary. But instead, Jesus gives his mother into the keeping of the disciple John. The overwhelming conclusion is that Joseph died sometime during the hidden years, which means Jesus, as a young man, lost his father. Imagine what that would have been. Joseph was not only his father in the eyes of the world. He was his teacher, his protector, the man who had shielded the family from the beginning, the one who had taught him the trade and worked beside him at the bench every day. And now he was gone. Jesus would have grieved him, really grieved him, with the raw human grief of a son who has lost a good father. Whatever else was true about who Jesus was, this was true. He knew, from the inside, the particular pain of losing a parent. He stood at a graveside. He watched his mother become a widow. He felt the hole that a death tears in a family. The Son of God grieved. And notice what that means for everything that came after. When Jesus later stood before grieving people, before the widow of Nain following her only son's body, before the sisters weeping for Lazarus, and when the Gospel tells us that Jesus wept, he was not weeping as a stranger to grief. He knew it. He had buried his own father. He had held his own grieving mother. The compassion he showed the bereaved was not the pity of someone looking in from outside. It was the fellow feeling of a man who had stood exactly where they stood. The hidden years taught him grief, and the death of Joseph changed the shape of Jesus' daily life completely. Because in that world, when the father of a household died, responsibility fell to the eldest son. And so, on the day Joseph died, Jesus, likely still a young man, perhaps in his late teens or 20s, became the head of the household. The workshop was now his. The livelihood of the family now rested on his shoulders. The care of his widowed mother was now his responsibility. Overnight, he went from being a son learning a trade to being the man of the house, the provider, the one everyone depended on. And he carried it. For years, perhaps many years, Jesus ran that workshop, provided for his mother, and held the household together. This was his life. Not preaching, not miracles. The daily, unglamorous, faithful work of a young man, providing for his widowed mother in a poor village, getting up every morning to the labor, bringing in enough to keep them fed, being the steady, reliable presence his family leaned on. The Son of God spent years of his hidden life simply being a good son and a faithful provider, doing the quiet, honorable, ordinary work of holding a family together after a loss. And he was not providing for his mother alone. Because the Gospels tell us that Jesus had brothers and sisters, the people of Nazareth named them James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, and sisters too. Whatever we understand about exactly who they were, the household Jesus headed after Joseph's death was a full one, with younger members to feed and look after. So the weight on the young provider was heavier still. He was not just keeping himself and his mother. He was helping to hold together a whole family, the eldest carrying the load for the younger ones in the years after the father was gone. This is the daily reality behind the silent years, not solitude, but a crowded, demanding, ordinary family life, with Jesus at the center of it, working to keep them all. And think of what that taught him about people, day in and day out. Living in a crowded household, working a demanding trade, carrying responsibility for others year after year. This is the school of patience, of forbearance, of love, that is not a feeling, but a daily choice. The endless small frictions of family life. The sacrifices no one notices. the putting of others before yourself again and again, because they depend on you. Everything Jesus would later teach about serving others, about laying down your life for those you love, about the greatest being the one who serves. He had already been living it, quietly, for years, as the eldest son holding up a family in a poor village. He did not learn it from a book. He lived it at home. And there is something deeply moving in that. For anyone who has ever had to grow up too fast, to shoulder a family after a loss, to become the provider before they were ready. Millions of people know that story from the inside. The death of a parent, and the responsibility that lands on the ones left behind. Jesus knew it too. He lived it. For years in the silence of Nazareth, he was simply a young man carrying his family through the years after his father's death. And no one wrote it down, because from the outside it looked like nothing at all. Just an ordinary man, doing his duty. Which is exactly what makes it extraordinary. And so the years went on, and on. And this is perhaps the most mysterious part of the whole hidden life. Not the work, not even the grief, but the sheer length of the waiting. Because remember what surrounded his birth. An angel to Mary, an angel to Joseph, a star and wise men from the east, shepherds and singing in the night sky, an old man in the temple declaring him the salvation of the world, a prophetess giving thanks. Everything about his coming into the world announced that this child was the promised one, the hope of the ages. And then, nothing. For 30 years, nothing. The child who had been heralded by angels grew up and worked as a carpenter, and buried his father and provided for his mother, and the great promise seemed to go completely quiet. Think about what that silence must have held. Mary knew who he was. She had treasured it in her heart for decades. And Jesus himself, at 12, had already spoken of his father's business. And yet the years passed, and passed, and still he was only the carpenter of Nazareth. 20 years old, and still at the bench. 25, and still fixing the village's roofs. Approaching 30, and still an unknown craftsman in a forgotten town. If you had been Mary, watching, you might have wondered when, or whether, the promise would ever unfold. If you had been a neighbor, you would have seen nothing remarkable at all. Just Joseph's son, the carpenter, living a quiet, ordinary life like everyone else. And this long waiting is one of the most human and most instructive things about the hidden life. Because Jesus was not idle in those years, and he was not failing. He was waiting. He was living faithfully in obscurity, doing good ordinary work, caring for his family, growing in wisdom and strength, until the time was right. The Gospel's one line about these years says exactly this. He grew. He grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. The growth was real. It was just hidden. The waiting was not wasted time. It was preparation. And there is a discipline in that waiting that is almost harder to imagine than the ministry itself. Because Jesus knew who he was. At 12, he had already spoken of his Father's business. He carried within him, all through those years, the awareness of what he had come to do. And yet, he waited. Year after year, he did not force it, did not rush it, did not seize his moment before it came. He stayed at the bench. He fixed the roofs. He provided for his mother. He submitted himself to the slow, ordinary passage of 18 years, when he could have, in his own mind at least, felt every day that there was a world out there that needed him. That is a staggering patience. Most of us, given a great calling, can barely wait a season to begin. Jesus waited nearly 2 decades, in perfect faithfulness, until the Father's time, not his own, had come. The hidden years were, among other things, the greatest act of patience in history. And there is enormous comfort in that, for anyone whose own life feels like a long season of waiting, of doing ordinary work, unnoticed, wondering when their real life will begin, whether the promise they once felt will ever come to anything. Because the greatest life ever lived was, for most of its length, exactly that. A long season of hidden, ordinary, waiting faithfulness, with no sign that anything was coming. Jesus spent 18 years in obscurity before the 3 years that changed the world. If your life feels small and unremarkable and stalled right now, you are in the most extraordinary company. The hidden years say that the quiet, waiting, ordinary seasons are not empty. They are where you are being made ready. And underneath the waiting, something was being formed. Because those long, silent years were not just time passing. They were the years in which the fullness of who he was settled and deepened and ripened. The patience, the compassion learned through grief, the wisdom gathered from watching ordinary life, the strength forged in daily labor, the intimacy with his Father, deepened in 18 years of morning and evening prayer. All of it was being quietly built, in the silence, in the ordinary, where no one could see. And then, at last, the waiting ended. And then came the morning that ended the hidden years. Somewhere around his 30th year, news reached Galilee of a wild prophet down in the wilderness by the Jordan, a man named John, calling people to repentance, baptizing them in the river, saying that one was coming after him greater than himself. And Jesus heard it, and he knew that his time had come. Imagine that last ordinary morning. He woke, as he had 10,000 times, in the small house in Nazareth. He said his prayers, as he always had. Perhaps he ate his bread with his mother. And then, this time, instead of crossing to the workshop, he set down the life he had lived for 18 years. He laid down the tools. He left the bench. He said goodbye to his mother, and to the village, and to the only life the world had ever known him to have. And he walked out of Nazareth and turned south, toward the Jordan, and toward everything that was about to happen. Picture Mary in that doorway, watching him go. She had known this day was coming since an angel spoke to her as a girl. She had treasured the secret of who he was for 30 years. Through all the ordinary days, through the death of Joseph, through the long silence. And now, at last, the hidden years were ending, and the promise was unfolding, and her son was walking out the door toward the destiny she had always known and always dreaded. She let him go, and she would have watched him until he was out of sight on the road, the way mothers do. And think of the courage it took him, too, to make that walk. For 18 years he had lived a safe, respected, ordinary life. He was known and trusted in his village. He had a trade, a place, a role. He could have lived out his whole life that way. A good carpenter, a good son, a good neighbor, dying old in Nazareth, mourned by the town, and no one beyond it ever knowing his name. That path was open, and it was safe. Instead, he laid it all down. He walked away from the only security he had ever known, toward a path that he understood better than anyone, would lead through conflict and rejection, and finally to a cross. The hidden years were the safe years, and when they ended, he chose, with open eyes, to leave the safety behind. That walk out of Nazareth was one of the bravest steps ever taken. And there is something almost unbearably poignant about the fact that this is where the silence ends. For 18 years, the great bulk of his life, nothing was recorded, because from the outside there was nothing to record. Just a carpenter, in a poor town, living a quiet, good, ordinary life. And then he walked down to the Jordan, and John baptized him, and the heavens opened, and a voice said, "This is my beloved Son." And everything the hidden years had quietly prepared came pouring out into the world. The 3 years that would change history had begun, but they had been 18 years in the making. And here is the thing to hold on to. When Jesus walked out of that workshop, he was not a blank slate. He was not starting from nothing. He carried 18 years of Nazareth inside him, the patience of the craftsman, the grief of the son who had buried his father, the compassion of the man who had cared for a widow, the wisdom of one who had watched ordinary human life up close for decades, the strength of a body formed by hard labor, the intimacy with God of a man who had prayed every morning of his life. Everything he would be in his ministry, he had already become in the silence. The hidden years were not the prelude to his life. They were most of it, and they made him who he was. So step back now and look at the whole hidden life, those 18 silent years, reconstructed, and ask what it all means. Because there is something here that changes how you see everything. The first thing it means is this: that God honored ordinary life. Think about it. God came to earth and chose to spend the overwhelming majority of his human life not doing miracles, not teaching crowds, not being celebrated, but doing ordinary work in an ordinary town, in an ordinary family, entirely unknown. He blessed the hidden life by living it. He made the workshop holy by working in it. He made the daily labor of ordinary people sacred by doing it himself for 18 years. If you have ever felt that your quiet, unremarkable, unnoticed life does not matter, the hidden years of Jesus are God's answer. He spent most of his own life exactly there. Ordinary faithfulness is not lesser. He chose it. The second thing it means is that the greatest work is often invisible. Everything essential about who Jesus was, his patience, his compassion, his wisdom, his strength, his intimacy with God, was formed not in the spotlight of the ministry, but in the silence of Nazareth, where no one was watching. The hidden years were the roots. The ministry was only the fruit, and it is almost always so. The most important formation of a human life happens in private, in the ordinary, in the seasons no one sees. If you are living through a hidden season right now, unseen, unrewarded, wondering if any of it matters, the silent years say that this is exactly where the real work gets done. And the third thing it means is that no ordinary day is wasted. Every unremarkable morning in that workshop, every ordinary meal, every routine repair, every quiet evening of prayer, every year of faithful waiting, all of it was part of it. None of it was filler. None of it was time to be gotten through until the real life began. It was the real life. And the same is true for us. The ordinary days are not the waiting room before your life matters. Lived faithfully, they are the substance of a life. Jesus proved it. He spent 18 years of ordinary days becoming the man who would change the world. And perhaps that is the deepest gift that the hidden years give us. Because most of us will never have 3 famous years. Most of us will live almost our entire lives in the equivalent of Nazareth, in ordinary work, in ordinary families, in ordinary towns, unknown to the world, our days unrecorded, our faithfulness unseen. And it can feel sometimes as though a life like that does not count for much. The hidden years of Jesus are the answer to that fear. Because he chose that life, he spent the overwhelming majority of his time on earth living exactly the kind of quiet, ordinary, hidden life that most of us live. And he made it holy simply by living it well. Your Nazareth years are not the lesser part of your life. In his case, they were most of it, and they were enough to hold the Son of God. When Jesus was 12, the Bible showed him to us in the temple, and then it closed the door for 18 years. And behind that door was not emptiness. Behind it was a carpenter at his bench, with calloused hands, a son, grieving a father, and taking up the burden of a household. A young man, providing faithfully for his widowed mother. A watcher of ordinary life, gathering the parables he would one day tell. A soul waiting patiently in obscurity, praying every morning, being quietly made ready. For most of his life on this earth, the Son of God was simply a good and faithful ordinary man, unknown to the world. That is the hidden life of Jesus. And now you have stepped inside it. If this gave you a new way to see Jesus, and a new way to value your own hidden, ordinary days, subscribe. Because we rebuild the world of the Bible and take you inside it. No lectures, no sermons, just the ancient world, rebuilt. And if you are living through your own long season of quiet, ordinary, unseen faithfulness, tell me in the comments. You are in the best of company. I read everyone. Thank you for walking these hidden years with me. I'll see you in the next one.